All right, we're on the back side of day one notes for unit 3, and up at the top it says function notation, inputs and outputs. And this says we replace the y with f of x. So what we have to realize is hopefully you guys know what synonyms are, like sofa and couch. They describe the same thing, but they are two different words. Dog and puppy, right? Same animal, just two different words. So y and f of x are synonyms of each other in math. They mean exactly the same thing. Okay. How you read f of x is literally the letter f, the word of, and x. F of x is how this right here is read. And so in Algebra 2, they tend to take the y and they replace it with an f of x. Why do they do that? Not to be difficult. They just want you to realize the connection between the x and the y. When you say x and y, that's two different variables. People don't see the connection. But if you say x and f of x, that the y, which is f of x, is coming from plugging the x value in, then there's a little bit more of a connection there, and that's what happens. But it's harder to understand, and so that's why they don't do it to you until Algebra 2 for the most part, although you've seen it in Algebra as well. Anything inside the parentheses here represents the x value. So just think f of x, right? X is inside the parentheses, so whatever they put inside those parentheses is going to represent x, okay? Also known as your input value, what you're putting into an equation. The answer represents the y value, also known as the f of x, okay? That's your output, it's what you get out. Okay. So in number 1, it says given y equals negative x squared plus 3x minus 5, find y when x equals 4. Okay. So they want to know, what was the domain input variable? Well, domain and input is your x. That's your x variable. And in this question, the number is going to be 4. That's what's going in for x. And they want to know what the range or the output variable is. Well, the output variable will be your y, but we don't know what we get yet. So we're going to have to go ahead and do that. So we're going to keep our y equals. The negative stays. Remember, when you substitute something in, it goes in parentheses, and the only thing you're substituting in is the thing that goes in parentheses. So notice my negatives on the outside because I wasn't subbing in a negative 4, and the squared's on the outside because I wasn't subbing in 4 squared. I was just subbing in 4. And then plus 3, and then in parentheses goes 4 again, and then minus 5. Okay. We can do this by hand because you guys should know how to do things by hand. But in this very first one, exponents first. And so 4 squared is 16, and then the negative goes in front of it, so it becomes negative 16. 3 times 4 is 12, and then minus 5. Okay. Negative 16 plus 12 is negative 4 minus 5. And negative 4 minus 5 gives us a y value of negative 9. And that's what our output is. And so if you think about it, if your input or your x value is 4 and your output or your y value is negative 9, if you were to graph that equation, it would be a parabola, and on that parabola would be this point, 4 comma negative 9. It would fall on it. It would be in the table if you looked in your calculator. Okay, so it says when using function notation, it would be written as, and we just went through all of that. This is exactly the same work that we have up here. Okay. Notice the 4 is the only thing in parentheses. Okay. This means that the input, which is 4, after plugged in, results in an output of negative 9. Okay, pretty easy. All right, so let's go ahead and try these examples at the bottom. It said, given the following, identify if given the input or the output value, and plug value into its appropriate place and solve. So sometimes they give you the x, which is very common. However, sometimes they give you the y, so you just have to be careful. Okay. So in number 2, it says if f of x is equal to 3x to the 4th plus 2x, they want you to find f of 2. Well, remember, f of 2, f of x, this 2 right here inside the parentheses represents your x value. And so all we're going to do is we're going to replace every x that we see with a 2. And so f of x becomes f of 2 equal to 3 times 2 to the 4th plus 2 times 2. And then we're just going to go ahead and simplify it. Okay. According to PEMDAS, exponents are first, 2 to the 4th means 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, which is 16. You can also use your calculator. And then 2 times 2 is 4. And we get a little bit more multiplication in the front here. 3 times 16 is 48, and 48 plus 4 is 52. Again, you can use your calculator. And so what this means is that the point, if I were to graph this equation, on that graph would be the point 2, 52. If you went to your table in your calculator, you would see 2, 52, or 2 in the x column, 52 in the y column. Okay? Number 3. If g of x is equal to x squared minus 3x plus 2, find g of negative 4. So again, g of x, g of negative 4. That means that negative 4 inside the parentheses represents x. Same thing they told us up there. So we'll replace all the x's with negative 4. And then we'll go ahead and simplify. Again, we could type this right into our calculator, but it is also good to use our brains as well. And so negative 4 squared, remember negative 4 times negative 4, that's going to give you a positive 16. Negative 3 times negative 4, negative times a negative is a positive 12, plus 2. And we can go ahead and add all those numbers together. 16 plus 12 is 28. 28 plus 2 is 30. And that's our output value. G of negative 4 is equal to 30, meaning that if we were to graph this equation, which is a parabola or a quadratic, on that parabola would be the point negative 4, 30. If you went to your table in your calculator, that point would be there. Okay? All right. Number 4, given g of x equals 5x cubed minus 4x plus 3, find g of negative 1/2. Again, g of x, g of negative 1/2. Again, what's in the parentheses represents your x value. So all we're going to do is we're going to go through and plug in negative 1/2. This one's going to be a little bit more tricky to do the math mentally in our head. Therefore, what we could do is we could just go to our calculator, literally type in exactly what we wrote here. And when we're done, out comes a decimal. Although it's not a terrible decimal, it does not go on forever. So you don't have to math frac it. It is 4.375. If you do math frac it, it is the same thing as 35 over 8. Okay, therefore, if we were to graph this equation in our calculator, the point negative 1/2, which is your x value, comma 35/8, or that decimal of 4.375, would be on this graph. Okay, number 5. It says, given h of x equals 2/5 x minus 4, find x if h of x equals 12. So everybody see this one's a little bit different. There's no number inside the parentheses, which means our x value is missing. However, they did give us 12, therefore process of elimination, if they didn't give us our x, they must have gave us our y. And so we also have to remember that y equals 12 also means h of x equals 12, because h of x and y are synonyms in this question. Okay? So our 12 is going to go in for this h of x. So we'll say 12 equals 2/5 x minus 4. And now we got to work a little bit backwards to solve for this x here. There's two things that need to leave in order for x to get by itself. 2/5 is one of them, and the negative 4 is the other one. And I'm going to go ahead and remove the 4 first, almost like PEMDAS backwards when you're solving like this. 12 plus 4 is 16, which is equal to 2/5 x. Okay, there's two ways to get rid of 2/5. There's the old way where you're going to divide by 2/5. However, you really honestly need to make sure that that 2/5 is in parentheses. Otherwise, it will give you the wrong answer. What I want you guys to do is instead, now that we're in Algebra 2, the Algebra 2 way of getting rid of a fraction like that is not to divide by it, but to do what they call multiplying by the reciprocal. The reciprocal is just the flipping of the fraction. So 2/5 flips to 5/2, where the 5 is now on the top, not on the bottom. The 2 is on the bottom, not on the top. Okay? 2/5 times 5/2 actually multiplies to 1. 2 times 5 is 10. 5 times 2 is 10. And 10 over 10 is 1. And 1x is the same thing as just x. And that's why it works. And now we can go ahead and type that in our calculator. 5/2. Not super important to be in parentheses, but I always put every single fraction I enter into my calculator in parentheses so we stay out of trouble in case it does matter at some point. Okay. When we type that in our calculator, 5/2 or 2.5 times 16 is equal to 40. And so if we were doing a point on this graph, if we were to graph this is actually linear. It's a line. You can notice it's in the y equals mx plus b format. And our x value actually is 40. And then our y value is 12. And so the point 40, 12 would be on this graph. Okay. All right, number 6. In number 6, it says if g of x is equal to x squared plus 4x minus 12, find x when g of x equals -7. So again, notice they're not giving us x. However, they are giving us -7. And so that is our y value. However, in Algebra 2, we know our y value is now known as, in this question, g of x. Okay, so we're going to take that g of x out and we're going to replace it with -7 equal to x squared plus 4x minus 12. And if you notice in this one, in order to solve, we didn't have a square term in the last one, so that's why we could just move some stuff around and solve for x. But in this one, we have a square term, which means we're going to have two values of x, and we're not going to get them unless we factor, and we can't factor unless we're equal to 0. So we're going to go ahead and add that 7 over. When we're finished, we'll have x squared plus 4x. -12 plus 7 is -5, and we will be equal to 0. And now we can go ahead and say, hey, that's an easy trinomial. We can set up our x box. Our multiply is -5. Our add is +4. And our numbers must be 5 and 1. Except to get a 4 out of 5 and 1, the 1 must be negative, which helps our multiply, and it works in our add. He's an easy trinomial, so we can go ahead and factor it into x plus 5 and x minus 1, and we are equal to 0. We'll do a little t-chart. We take our one factor, we set it equal to 0. We take our second factor, we set it equal to 0. And on this side, we're going to go ahead and subtract 5, and we'll get x equals -5. And on this side, we add 1, and we end up with x equals +1. And there are the two values of x that we get. So what does that mean? On this graph, we would have -5, -7 as one of the points, and we would have 1, -7 as another point. And so we have 2 points on this graph that have a y value of -7. All right, number 7. It says if w of x is equal to this beautiful fraction, find x if w of x equals 6. And again, our x is missing. So we don't know what our value of x is. That's what we're going to try to find out. However, we do know that y equals 6. But technically in this question, our y is known as w of x. So we're going to go ahead and take that w of x out, and we're going to go ahead and plug 6 in. So we end up with 6 equals 5x minus 2 over x minus 3. And in the last unit, we talked about a fraction equaling a fraction, and you're allowed to cross multiply when that happens. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make the 6 into a fraction, and so that we can cross multiply. And this cross is going to be the easy one because you're multiplying by 1, so it stays 5x minus 2. and it's going to be equal to your other cross, which remember that you're going to have to distribute that 6. So 6 times x is 6x. 6 times negative 3 is negative 18. And now we don't have any more fractions, which is awesome. And we don't have any squared terms, so we can just go ahead and pick some terms and move them around. I'm going to go ahead and subtract 5x. And we end up with negative 2 equals x minus 18. We're going to go ahead and add 18. And we end up with 16 equals x. And so what that means to us is that if we were to graph this equation, the point on that equation would be 16, because that's your x, comma 6, because that's your y. And there would be the coordinates of the point on that graph. All right, so I hope that helps. I hope you can figure out what is an input. Remember, if it's in parentheses, it's the x, it's the input, it's what you're putting in for x. What you get out is your output, also known as your y value, okay? Sometimes they're written backwards, like these last 3 that I did in mostly green writing, that you have to be careful that if there's no number inside the parentheses, it's a work backwards when they're giving you your y value. All right, I hope that helps a little bit with function review, and I'll see you guys on day 2 notes. Thanks.